Welcome to the Inspired Podcast, Leading the Way in Education. I'm your host, Andrea De La Cerda, and each week I'm bringing you insightful discussions and news about changes in the landscape of education and entrepreneurship. As a 22-year entrepreneur, corporate executive, business coach, and leader, I mentor a community of change-making men and women to get out of their box and step into their true calling to make the biggest impact. I believe that increasing conflict in the world today is a sign of the need for systemic change and a call for authentic feminine power and passion to help make that happen. In today's episode, we're exploring a recently coined term in organizational development and workforce called drop to the top. We'll talk about what it is and why all global companies and cultures should care. For me, growing up, there was a lot of validation for a job well done. Maybe you can relate. I watched my dad put in hours upon hours of work into his job. Each day, the same schedule. I rarely saw him. He was up and out of the house, sometimes before dawn, and home in time for dinner and the bedtime routine, which was always led by my mom. It was predictable, productive, and it was a grind that promised a successful career down the road. He truly threw his whole self and identity into his work. In fact, when I think about him, it's really hard for me to think about him as a person separate from what he did for a living. And I will never forget that when I was starting my own career with my first corporate job, he would say to me, his advice was you'll be fine as long as you make yourself indispensable. So that's what I set out to do, make myself indispensable. Of course, it was long before I realized that the rules of the workplace were actually somehow different for me. They required extra effort for women to earn their spot as it was. So making myself indispensable really meant putting my head down and working harder and longer than anyone else. And if I did that, people would naturally recognize the value that I bring and I'd be promoted, right? And I know many of you listening can probably relate to this. And this strategy actually did work for me for a time. At least it kept me employed, albeit not necessarily fairly compensated. But funny enough, that didn't deter me from working harder and longer anyway. But I was still working. This strategy didn't really work so well by the time I entered into leadership roles. What brought me into leadership, I could tell, wasn't going to keep me there. Drop to the top is a term used to describe the decline in the number of women in senior leadership roles and C-suites, and it flags an essential shift in the workplace. Since 2015, the proportion of women appointed to leadership positions has been steadily increasing by 1% annually globally. But this trend started reversing in 2022, and current levels are back to where we were in 2021, so we're certainly going backwards now. And what's more concerning is that there doesn't really seem to be widespread intervention to reverse this trend. And it's important to talk about what widespread implications will take place if this doesn't change. If women don't feel engaged in the workplace and they're not encouraged to move into leadership roles, companies will certainly face a number of negative consequences, including a loss of innovation, decreased organizational performance, reduced employee morale and retention, a stagnant corporate culture, and ultimately, more gender inequality. Having women in leadership positions invites an opportunity to have a much bigger impact on engaging and supporting female employees. I love Sheryl Sandberg's story that does a really great job of bringing this point to light. She talks about having to schlep across the massive Google parking lot, extremely pregnant, in order to get to work. It was an increasingly difficult task for her, and one day she marched straight into Sergey Brin's office to tell him that Google needs pregnancy parking. Google's male executive team, of course, wasn't trying to ignore the needs of women, but they had never been pregnant before. I mean, they had never even thought about it. But Sandberg was fortunate enough to be in a position of leadership at Google. How much would have changed if she was an entry-level employee? Probably not at all. When I think back on the advice my dad gave me, while very well-meaning, perhaps, it doesn't consider at all the unique and very difficult path it is for women who want to make their way into leadership, but just continue being overlooked. The fact of the matter is that there's more out of our control in these scenarios than perhaps in our control. And it's causing women to move out of their corporate jobs and pursue other opportunities where they feel they can make a bigger impact. In my case, for example, my last corporate role of my career ended a few years ago, and I will never go back. Instead, I have found more satisfaction, security, personal and professional growth, and happiness being on my own than I ever did in a company. But I understand that everyone's story is different. But let's talk about how we fix it. I came across a great article in Forbes recently by Katie McPhee, an expert and coach for women in corporate leadership. She offers some really insights that are worth thinking about. First, she suggests that we first focus on the broken rung. This simply refers to identifying the earliest stages of the journey where there is a discrepancy between men and women. The data suggests that the gap begins early on in women's careers, with 87 being promoted for every 100 men. Fixing this would mean that a pool of many more women will be in middle management as a pool to be promoted over time. Next, she says, women need leadership development very early in their careers compared to men. Women don't put their hat in the ring for promotions unless they know they will meet all the criteria. So providing the training and coaching they need to help build their confidence is extremely important for women early on, more so than it is for men. Finally, intentionally hiring more first-time female vice presidents and senior vice presidents. Men are promoted based on potential, where women are promoted based on experience, so says the data. So getting women into senior leadership depends on really finding someone who's going to give them their first opportunity. Intentionally hiring more women into those first roles will provide the experience that they need in order to build on that. Now, this also recognizes that HR departments need to evaluate men and women somewhat differently and put processes in place that help to facilitate that versus looking at everybody equally. And this can be a big disconnect in some of the HR, human resources processes that are currently in place now. If you've spent any time in HR or have worked with HR, you know that the way they see things is on an equal basis, men to women. But we know that psychology of men to women is so different, which is going to perpetuate some of these gaps. So as we wrap up today's episode, it's really clear that this drop to the top, a phenomenon that we're seeing in women in leadership, highlights a critical issue in organizational development. This alarming trend of decreasing numbers of women in senior leadership roles, and my own journey from striving to making myself indispensable to witnessing the challenges women face in climbing the corporate ladder, it really underscores the urgency of addressing this issue. Women bring invaluable perspectives and innovation to leadership, and their absence at the top can really hinder organizational progress. To reverse this trend, we need targeted interventions, like addressing that broken rung, investing in early leadership development for women, and intentionally creating pathways for women to secure their first leadership roles. By embracing these strategies, we can create a more inclusive and dynamic landscape that benefits everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on the Inspired Podcast. Let's continue to lead the way and work toward a more equitable future. Thank you for listening. Let's continue to support each other in our paths toward empowerment and personal success, whatever that looks like for you. Tune in next week for another new episode. Thank you so much, and take care.